Dear friends, I hope you are doing well. In today's video, I will talk about some of the key elements that a good thesis introduction has to include. Of course, this is not to imply that these elements have to be involved in the same way and in the same order in all theses. Now, the first part that an introduction should involve is a background section or a background part where the researcher is supposed to set the scene for what is coming next. Of course, no thesis writer is supposed to jump headlong into the problem. By the way, here we need to avoid technicalities. We need to get rid of the technical jargon as much as possible, because the main role of this part called preliminaries or background is just to catch the interest of the reader. In this part, the researcher can also give some hints about the review of the literature by mentioning some authors, for example, but it is preferable that this is kept at a very general level, because there will be, a review of the literature chapter where the researcher treats the issue at stake with an adequate amount of detail. This background part also serves the purposes of making a good transition to a very important part. In fact, I would say it's the most important part in the introduction, and it's the part that every single reader, every single jury member is looking for. It's the research problem. Very briefly, a research problem is where you point out what's wrong. For example, you can point to problems of efficiency in teaching, for example, if there is a problem in efficiency. In learning, there might be problems with given methods, given processes, for example, and you can point out that these need to be improved. So this is one way of stating a problem. This is one chunk of a problem, in fact. Another thing you can include here is the disagreement in the literature, for example, among researchers. That's a problem. What needs to be borne in mind in this regard is that the research problem is one that is always linked to something that is practical. Concrete examples can relate to problems that students face in producing a given structure, or having problems with academic writing, with the use, for example, the frequency of slang words in students' writings. And by the way, this is phenomenal. The research problem can also help you find the research gap. What is the research gap? In very simple terms, a research gap can be defined as a question that previous research has been unable to answer, and that your study is making an attempt to replenish this gap. One of the tips for finding the research gap is just to go to previous literature and check the conclusions of previous works, previous theses, where you have a section called limitations and recommendations for future research. These can constitute your research gap, and these can be a very convincing part of your research problem. After we have set the background, after we have set the scene for the reader, and after we have stated our problem, pointing to the research gap that needs to be replenished, now the next step is to tell the reader what we will be focusing on, and that's the section of objectives. And I would like to refer you to a previous video where I talked about objectives at some length. Of course, in order to be convincing, we have to justify our objectives. We have to say why. This is a very important section. Again, so many students phrase their objectives, but without taking the trouble to say why, to justify them. When you justify your objectives, then you are making your study more credible. You are giving some legitimacy to your study, and this justification has to come in the rationale section. The rationale is where we answer the question why. Objectives are concerned with what, and the rationale is concerned with why. Why have we thought of doing what we are intending to do in our research? One way of justifying your objectives can be linked to previous research, and it is what we have mentioned in the research gap. It can be reiterated here in the form of because. Okay, so because previous research has not managed, for example, to answer this or that question, because it has not addressed this part of the issue, etc., So that's one way of justifying your objectives. Another way of finding rationale for your objectives is to say, for example, that there have been studies elsewhere, but local researchers have not addressed this yet. So it is an opportunity for me as a researcher to see to what extent this can apply, this can work in the Moroccan context, for example. A third point that you can mention as part of your rationale is your personal experience. For example, if you're talking about a difficulty in the acquisition of a given structure as a learner of English or as a teacher, you found difficulties teaching them, then you can insert that as your rationale. After this, of course, come our research questions from which we derive hypotheses. And I made a point about the difference between qualitative research design and a quantitative research design in the way these hypotheses are articulated. Okay, in a quantitative design, we have to define our variables ahead of time. The reason why our hypotheses need to be stated in a clear and direct manner. A number of theses would include another section after the research questions and hypotheses. It's the definition of key terms, and this relates to this is recommended because that's where you help the reader make his first contact with the technical jargon that you will be using across the thesis. And the last section, of course, is organization of the study, where the researcher informs the reader of the components of the thesis. It usually starts with something like the present dissertation is organized as follows. In the first section, a review of the literature will be provided where, etc. So you can add some prose there. But here we should be very brief. All that we need to do here is just point to what each individual chapter is about. You may refer to some subsections, but be brief. Finally, remember that your introduction is the gate to your thesis, and that it has to be written in good language, and it has to be by good language I mean a mistake-free language. What happens with some students is that perhaps they leave the introduction until the last minute, and then because they have a deadline, they are forced to submit it, and then the abstract and the introduction are drafted in a very quick way. And the outcome is, of course, that there are a lot of mistakes, a lot of inconsistencies. I hope I have shed some light on the introduction. If you have any comments, then please post them. Thank you very much.